we come into the story of Abraham and Sarah before their names are changed to those better known labels. At this point, they're still Abram rather than Abraham, and Sarai instead of Sarah. In chapter 15, when Abram expressed his concern to God about having no child to whom his estate would pass when he died, God gave the promise of a son. Abram's simple faith in God's faithfulness to keep that promise resulted in a fundamental change in their relationship. Abram's journey to faith began all the way back in Ur. It took faith in God, a good-sized chunk of it, to get him to leave his hometown and travel all the way to Haran, where he settled down for a while. But God's original command was to leave his father's house. The problem was his dad went with him to Haran. So once he passed there in Haran, Abram resumed his journey to the place that God had directed him, which was Canaan. The next years were spent as a nomad, leading an ever-growing group up and down the land until they eventually became a small tribe of a few hundred. Abram's journey of faith saw victories and losses as he learned to trust God. It seemed to be a case of 3 steps forward and 1 back. But it all came together in a definitive moment when Abraham's confidence in God shifted into a permanent trust at God's promise of a son. It's then that we read, Abram believed God, and God accounted it to him for righteousness. Now here's the thing. God promised that the son would be from his own body, meaning a biological child. What concerned Abram was that he and Sarai were getting on in years. They'd had no son yet, and the likelihood of it seemed to diminish as time passed. Well, even more time passed, and still no child. So Abram's and Sarai's minds went to work, considering how they might, help God out. Verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. Yeah, so? What's Hagar have to do with anything? Why is she mentioned right after we're reminded that Sarai is barren? Where's the story going now? Well, I'll tell you where. This is a major detour on the highway of faith that Abraham's been traveling. It's a side road. And they take it because a delay in the fulfillment of God's promise saw them scheming how they might make things happen. We'll see what their scheming produced in a bit. For now, it's good for us to ponder how all of this illustrates something important about faith. Faith, Hebrews chapter 11 says, is the substance of things hoped for. It's the evidence of things not seen. Now, since this is a study in Genesis and not Hebrews, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here. Suffice it to say, that word substance means something solid, real, having actual existence. Biblical faith, by which I mean genuine faith in the real God of the Bible, it's not some abstract ethereal wish. It isn't merely a mental projection onto the universe of what we want to be true. No, biblical faith already is the substance, the stuff, if you will, of the unseen realm. Think of it this way. This is a baseball. You see it, and because you do see it, you know it's real because your senses tell you so. Were we in the same room and you weren't just seeing this on a video, you could use your other senses to verify its reality. You could touch it, you could hear it as I drop it on the desk, you could smell it, yep, it's a real baseball, and even taste it if you wanted to employ all 5 senses. It's by the use of our senses that we perceive and so know the reality of the physical realm. But our senses are of no use in perceiving the spiritual realm because the senses are faculties of our physical bodies. They aren't spiritual faculties. What God's given us to perceive the reality and realities of the spiritual realm is faith. And that's why I like to refer to faith as the sense of the Spirit. Now, as we all know, our physical senses can be tricked. That's what the illusion of magic is all about. Because the mind works a certain way, we built up certain expectations. So our eyes expect to see something. An illusionist knows how to take advantage of that and manipulate actions so that our brains move to a conclusion that in fact isn't true, not real. Interesting that when we see how an illusionist tricks us, we wonder why we didn't see the illusion for what it was. If we see the trick performed again, we cannot not see the reality of what really happened. In a similar way, this is what separates biblical faith in the real God of the Bible from, generic religious faith in something else. People believe all kinds of stuff that isn't real because they've been lied to by a master of deception and illusion known as the devil. Faith is only real when it's focused on God, who cannot lie. He can't deceive. But, and this is where we circle back to Genesis, faith is also only active when that which is believed remains in the spiritual realm and is unrealized in the physical. Once that which is believed moves over into the realm of interaction with the five senses, it's not faith any longer. And that's why Hebrews says that faith is the substance of things hoped for. What God is looking for from us is faith. And so verse 6 of Hebrews 11 says, without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Faith is what it is when what we have is God's promise, but not the fulfillment. The fulfillment of God's promise is sure because he cannot fail. He always keeps his word. But for faith to be real and for it to be great faith, there has to be a gap of time, a space in which faith can be. This means that God makes a promise, then time passes and passes and passes, and then fulfillment. Abram and Sarai had a promise. What they didn't have was fulfillment because God was seeking to develop faith in them. Instead of waiting patiently on him for the fulfillment of the promise, they conspired to bring about their own fulfillment of it. Verse 2. So Sarai said to Abram, see now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So Abram is now 85, Sarai is 75. Their barrenness has become a trial that she thinks that she can no longer endure. And so she proposes a solution: surrogacy. Her maidservant Hagar, who they'd picked up while they were in Egypt, well, she can serve as Sarai's substitute. Now, in the ancient world, any child that Hagar would have would be considered Abram and Sarai's in this kind of arrangement. According to some Jewish commentaries on this passage, Abram and Sarai wondered if they were barren because they'd made that stop in Haran until Terah, Abram's father, died. So their barrenness, their thinking, might be punishment for not going immediately from Ur all the way to Canaan. They'd assumed that as soon as they arrived in Canaan, God would give them children. But 10 years have passed, and they're still childless. So Sarai is desperate. Her biological hourglass is about out of sand, and so she starts scheming. Sarai's intentions seem good. She's willing to share her husband with another woman, all so that they can have a child. Now, this is a pretty drastic sacrifice that she makes, and it reveals her desperation. But of course, Abram, being the spiritual giant and the leader that he is, well, he's going to tenderly correct his wife, right? He's going to gently rebuke her lack of faith, or at least he's going to suggest that they take her plan to the Lord, get his approval. If only. Verse 4. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived. Abram, what are you doing? Well, it's obvious. He listened to and had taken counsel from someone who, well, doesn't share his faith. Oh, sure, Sarai believed in God, but we never read that the promise of God was spoken to her. It came to Abram. Here, Sarai tells Abram how to follow God, but the revelation hadn't come to her. She applied mere human wisdom to the life of faith. And Abram foolishly listened to her. Sarai was a proponent of the concept, God helps those who help themselves. It's important that we exercise care in who we listen to and take counsel from. There are some, highly successful people who may give us excellent advice from the world's perspective, but who will in reality short circuit what God intends for us. Following their advice may result in complications and trouble that last for years, as it did with Sarai, Abram, and Hagar. Now, what ought they have done? Well, they should have waited on the Lord. Yes, it's been 10 years, and that's a long time. It will be another 13 after this till the promise is fulfilled. But it will be fulfilled because God is faithful. Here's how it works. He promises, we believe, and wait for him to do what he said he'd do. Verse 4, so he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. And so the trouble begins. Up to this point, no one knew where the barrenness lay, with Sarai or Abraham. All doubt is now removed. Sarai's womb was closed. When Hagar turns up pregnant, she immediately becomes haughty and starts treating Sarai poorly. Abraham will now show attention and affection to Hagar as the mother of his only child. Well, that was just too much for Sarai, and so she goes ballistic. Verse 5. Then Sarai said to Abram, my wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me. Now, why does Sarai blame Abraham for this whole thing? It had been her idea. And the fact is, she was devastated as she begins to see the implications of her and Abraham's actions. Sin is already beginning to bear its bitter fruit. Really, Sarai has cause to complain. Abraham ought to have taken the spiritual lead and declined the suggestion of surrogacy as the solution to their being childless. If and when a man defers to his wife's counsel, he's still responsible for the outcome. Verse 6, so Abraham said to Sarai, indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do with her as you please. And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. Abraham was right at this point to put the relationship with his wife before the relationship with Hagar or their child. But Abraham had an obligation and a duty to the child that he ought to have covered. He didn't do that. He left the fate of both Hagar and her child solely in Sarai's hands. Sarai treated Hagar so poorly, she ran away. Verse 7. Now the angel of the Lord found her, that is Hagar, by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. This is the first time that we meet this interesting Old Testament character, the angel of the Lord. At other times, we read of generic angels and an angel from the Lord. But the angel of the Lord refers to a specific person who identifies himself as God. This is an appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament. It's known as a Christophany. Now, verse 9, the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. The problems seem to have stemmed from Hagar's haughtiness towards Sarai. The angel of the Lord comes to her with a message that she's to return to Sarai and submit herself to her. Verse 10, then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. Ishmael means God hears. Verse 12, he shall be a wild man, and his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Now, Ishmael becomes the father of the Arabian tribes. They populated the entire Middle East, finding little places to settle down and grow all through the regions and ethnic groups of the area. Though they lived in the midst of many other peoples, they maintained their own culture, which often came into conflict with their neighbors. Arabic tribes were known for their, constant warfare against each other. To this day, the different Arabic tribes fight and vie with one another for control of that region. This is one of the major factors that led to the success and the spread of Islam among the Arabs. They were so war-weary and brutalized from the generations of fighting one another. They saw in Muhammad's religion a unifying force that would bring an end to their internecine conflicts and give them a larger goal, which is ultimately world conquest. Verse 13. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees. Now in Hebrew, that's El Roi. For she said, have I also here seen him who sees me? Therefore, the well was called Be'er Lahairoi. Observe, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. Now it seems that Hagar did as the Lord told her. She returned in submission to Sarai. She told Abram and Sarai about her encounter with the angel of the Lord, and when her child was born, Abram named him as the Lord had instructed him, Ishmael.